grab this mic. All right, hello everyone. Thanks so much for coming out. There are a few chairs available up here at the front, so please don't be shy. Thank you all so much for coming to spend your Monday evening with us. My name is Amali, and I'm the events director here at Books Are Magic. We are so excited to have Amy Rowland and Lee Conell with us tonight to celebrate the launch of Amy's newest novel, Inside the Wolf. But before we get into all of that, I just want to point out a few logistics for how tonight's event is going to go. First off, we will be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of the discussion, so please start thinking of questions to ask and hold on to them. After the talk tonight, Amy will be signing and personalizing books at the alcove next to where you checked in. We'll let you know where and when to start lining up for that. And lastly, if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we would love to encourage you to buy a copy of Inside the Wolf online using the link in the live stream description. All right, let's get into this. Full of ghost stories, folk tales, and ill-fating omens, Inside the Wolf follows Rachel Reskin as she leaves New York City to return to her rural North Carolina hometown. When tragedy strikes again shortly after Rachel's arrival, she is forced to reconcile with the guilt of her past and attempt to halt the cycle of generational trauma that plagues her and her community. As Lauren LeBlanc writes in her New York Times book review, Inside the Wolf is a vital Southern novel that speaks to a violent American legacy. Amy Rowland is the author of 2 novels. The transcriptionist received the Addison M. Metcalf Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Her work has been published or is forthcoming in the New York Times, the Southern Review, the Iowa Review, Literary Hub, New Letters, and other publications. A former editor at the New York Times Book Review, she's currently a lecturer at University of California, Berkeley. And as I mentioned earlier, Lee Conell joins Amy in conversation tonight. Lee is the author of the novel The Party Upstairs, which was awarded the Rowland Award, and the story collection Subcortical, which received the Story Prize Spotlight Award and an Independent Publisher Book Award. Her stories and essays, which appear in journals such as Oxford American, Kenyon Review, and the Paris Review Daily, have been shortlisted in Best American Stories and the Pushcart Prize Anthology. All right, so that's all from me. Without any further delay, please join me in giving Amy and Lee a very warm welcome.
Hi, Amy. Hi, Lee. Is this working?
Yep.
Yeah, great. So I know, Amy, you opted not to read at the beginning of our conversation. So I was hoping it would be okay if I just read the first line of your novel, which I loved so much, and I thought we could kind of spool out from there.
Sure.
So
I can probably
you could probably
remember it.
Do you want? Would you like to? I think I
Sure.
remember too, but if I got it wrong, it would be really, really embarrassing. So I think you should.
No, I think I can do it.
Yeah.
I buried a wolf today. That's my best sentence ever. I think it's all downhill.
Done. It's a really, really good sentence. And I was wondering how, if you started this novel from that sentence, or just if you could speak a little bit of the genesis of this novel and where it kind of began for you.
I think I can speak about the genesis, although I don't know that I can be trusted, because I thought that this book started with that sentence and an image, but in the last couple of days I found on my laptop a folder from 2012 titled Southern Novel that had a note at the beginning that said something like, "She returns home and can't let it rest, long dash, and red wolves," which is pretty much the novel of 2023. So the genesis must be deeper or older than I thought, which is kind of scary because I wrote the book.
Yeah, where things start is often kind of terrifying if you start digging into it. And also I love that it was lurking on your desktop with that descriptive title, Southern Novel. because also I love the title that you wound up with, Inside the Wolf, and it's funny that you mentioned and red wolves in the document, because when I was reading, I was scrawling notes as I went, and when we got to the wolves, and especially the red wolves, I wrote red wolves with lots of exclamation marks, because I thought, in addition to all these nuanced ways this novel talks about North and the South, urban and rural life, class, race, there's also this beautiful nuanced take on human and non-human life. There's all these animals kind of running through this novel, raccoons, the red wolf, of course, the bats, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how this menagerie of animals showed up in this novel, and maybe if there was any animal in particular, I'm curious, as you were writing it too, that kind of showed up for you or was important to you in the writing process.
I didn't intend to write about so many animals. They just kept showing up. The red wolves were important because of what they represent and symbolize partly, and also because I'm from one of the 5 counties in North Carolina where they exist. Yes, the other novels kept showing up, and I mean the other animals kept showing up, and I suppose it's in part that through our encounters with non-human animals, it seems that we sometimes there's sometimes not necessarily a recognition, but an exchange that has broader implications, and also a way to explore in the writing, working with animals or thinking with animals or thinking through animals was a way for me to help me think about the South, or the South that I'm from. I don't know that makes sense, but I think the animals also, they just help me think in a different register, I think, and add some texture to the world.
Yeah, I love the idea of texture, and I was thinking too when I was reading it, how in this novel there's so much silence, like so much about what does and does not get said or articulated, and the animals in some ways kind of, I don't know, they seem to me to be speaking in a way to what goes unsaid, and how do we start to communicate that, which is one of the things I felt like the novel was exploring in a really interesting way. But that might be off base to
No,
what they were doing.
No, I don't. That's not off base.
Thank you.
But you know, there's of course the famous Nagel essay about what is it like to be a bat, you know, and thinking about what it means to embody a different being. And I wanted to explore that in a way that helped me think about the South. Not only, you know, what is it like to embody a different animal, but what is it like to participate in a community that you feel alienated from?
Yeah, I know that we don't have to talk a ton about personal experience or however much you want, but I was thinking about something that you captured so well, which was this kind of double vision that Rachel has in the novel, in terms of the time she spent in New York City, and then of course growing up in Eastern North Carolina. I was telling you too, my partner's from North Carolina and has a lot of family in Eastern North Carolina, and it was just, I thought the way that you approached and captured what it is to kind of carry 2 different places in you and trying to navigate that was just really beautifully done. And it can be kind of a scary thing too. So much of this novel is about fear as well, I think, and I don't know, you don't, like, to what degree it makes sense to you? Do you want to talk at all about kind of how the South informed the novel and how the North informed the novel, and like how you kind of dealt with that complexity in writing it, or how Rachel kind of deals with it, if that's more interesting?
Well, I wanted to make her do it, to explore how someone similar to me but not me might try to fit in this community. And I navigate this territory a lot myself because I go, back and forth between, I will probably never live in Eastern North Carolina again, but I do visit quite frequently. And the world, that I revisit there is extremely different from the world that I live in now. And so that's what I was trying to explore through a character who returns with great ambivalence and then ends up, trying to make a go of it.
Yeah, it's funny thinking about these two really different places. Maybe tying back to the animal question, I was remembering when I was reading this. I hope this isn't like a strange thing to share, but Amy sent me an email of her, which included a photo of your writing spot, like where you were working, and there was a deer, like, and it wasn't of the writing really, it was the deer, but I knew that writing was going on in that vicinity, and I thought that was so interesting that animal showed up in that picture, and of course it's so important too to this novel. Were there any animals or sort of signs or images or things like that were important to you, or that kind of showed up in the writing process?
Well, I'm very attached to the deer because they do show up in the yard in Berkeley, and they are different. Some are shy, some are curious, some are skittish, some are bold, and so I do have these encounters with them that influence my writing. And once you have, so then I was curious, or I started noticing more, I guess, other encounters with other animals. I know we both are interested in birds.
Yeah, one of my main pandemic activities was caring for these wounded pigeons, which was the whole thing. But
talk about great animal photos.
Yes.
I really enjoyed those.
It was a good exchange. But I really love that, and I guess that was something I was thinking about too, was just how there's almost this mosaic of creatures in this novel, and they build on each other and they speak to each other, but they're never just like simple symbols. They really get to occupy their own mysterious place in this book. And then maybe that leads me to the other thing I really loved in this was your use of fairy tales and folklore, which in a similar way kind of, there's different stories, different myths that show up, and they kind of accrue and talk to each other. And I would just love to know more about how you got to that place where these myths and folklore and fairy tales were sort of I don't want to say invading the story, but kind of like really taking a strong place in the story, and if any of them were especially important to you.
Well, I'm interested in how all of those things, folklore and fairy tales, operate in oral cultures, and the symbolism of the language and the role they occupy. And also, it helped me to think about what we retell and what we don't, and how we distort it, and how it's passed down. And so that was very much in my mind, and I think the specific stories just broke through. There are a few stories in the novel that are my own rewritings of the stories I grew up with. So they, I didn't start out that way. I started with a George Eliot scholar. That was the original narrator, and she was a different type of character. But I thought, I'm interested in the way George Eliot handles the agrarian life in the community, and so I thought that would work, but it did not work. And I don't know exactly when, but somehow the Virginia Dare story came up pretty quickly for me. I grew up with that story. And so then as soon as the narrator shifted to a folklore scholar, it just fit, you know, the tone felt right all of a sudden. And I knew that that's what it was about. That was the lens.
Yeah. Wait, so which stories did you end up tweaking or changing a little bit in the book?
So The Witch Bride is a rewrite, and Virginia Dare is just my own version, you know, is the way I remember it from childhood. And the story involving Palmer is actually the Mako Light, but I did not rewrite that in the book on purpose. I didn't feel that it was mine to do. So.
Yeah, it's interesting which stories kind of feel like appropriate or open to twisting and changing, and which ones you kind of have to let lie.
Right.
Were there any stories for you growing up that showed up in this that like freaked you out particularly?
Right. Well, some of them are ghost stories, which are both local and universal, right? But the thing that interests me, I guess, is that I didn't know. There's some stories you know and you can't remember when you first heard them. You feel like you already know them when you hear them or the first time you read them. And I find that interesting, like how things are passed down in ways that are, they're so prominent in the culture, especially stories that involve lessons for girls and women or warnings.
Okay, so I have to ask, maybe could you, I don't know how long the original Witch Bride story is, and you don't have to tell us all a fairy tale or a story right now, but could you, what is the original story of the Witch Bride?
The original story of the Witch Bride is, I think it might be in, I used to have, I still have a little paperback book of ghost stories of the Carolinas, of North Carolina. And I think it's called The Witch Hag or something in that. And it's about a woman who escapes her skin, you know, flies away at night. And that story has always struck me, you know, her freedom is her demise. And so I rewrote that quite a bit and quite often. And so I added some detail, but not too much, which is the other thing that interests me about these stories. There's no context. You know, they all start and there's no, you don't know, I mean, other people have written about it, but you know, you don't know why the beast of Beauty and the Beast is the beast. How did he turn into a beast? Why, you know? But he just is, and that's where the story begins. And you take all of these things at face value.
Yeah, and what you said about like lessons for women and girls being kind of embedded into these stories, that again, like you said, you ingest them at face value, not kind of taking the time to really pick apart where those lessons came from or what they mean. So I love this. I love even more knowing that you changed some of those stories and that in a way you get to rewrite them in the context of your book. There's something kind of powerful about that.
Thanks.
So in addition to these works of folklore and fairy tales that you put in and twist and change, there's also just a real groundedness to this novel. It's really grounded in place, and I guess I had a couple of things I was thinking about with that. One thing I was curious was if you had to do any research beyond kind of what you carry with you in writing this novel. Particularly, there's so many really specific details about crops, and even my first question about the animals that kind of grace this novel. There's a lot of facts about them that I found really fascinating. I'm curious if you had like it was kind of a research mode at all with this book.
I did light research. I did research red wolves a little bit, and I did read a book on the Lost Colony, Virginia Dare, and I did some fact checking. You know, I would have to ask my dad, what's a hex key again? What's the, and you realize, the divide, how people live in different worlds. These are things that I knew or that I should have known. I grew up in this world, and now I've forgotten what these tools are and what they do, and I have to ask someone else. So I did that sort of research, but I also had to be a little bit careful. I don't know if you find this, but I really like research, and I can make research an excellent form of procrastination. And so I think it's a little tricky being a novelist, because you need to do enough research to imagine a full, complete world and do justice to it. But you can also be paralyzed, I think, with too much research.
Yes. I really relate to the procrastination research thing, especially when you get all those great animal facts going on, and you can get the cute animal videos, and it keeps going.
Yeah.
But
I had the really weird experience this week of, I have a Google alert on red wolves, and I showed up in my own Google alert on red wolves, so I was like, all right, this is too weird, it's over. I'm deleting that alert.
Yeah, no. But it's funny, I love that part of your research experience involved talking to your father. With my novel too, there's a building super, and my dad was a building super,
Right.
and so I had to sometimes just reach out to him with really specific questions. And I guess knowing that, I'm curious, did those questions, were they just kind of like one-off questions and then the conversation is over, or did it lead to any other kinds of information or storytelling?
Well, I had a list, and they started with, how many tobacco sticks fit in one of those old tobacco barns, and then it evolved. Also, I decided to do a name check at the end, because I was sure that if I had used a name of someone that I knew, in my area, in my North Carolina background, I would make sure I used a different last name. And so I double checked with my parents that they didn't know anyone, with this specific name, and of course they did. So I had to do some switching with first and last names to make sure, and then double check again. But the questions, and I asked my brother some questions too, because I grew up among hunters, and so they have a different perspective on animals, and that was really interesting. It led to some interesting conversations, especially around red wolves, because they're an example of the way two groups really talk past each other, because wildlife conservationists believe rightly that these animals are being extinguished in their native habitat, and then you speak to people in eastern North Carolina who are acutely alert to government overreach as they see it, and they feel that you can't tell the difference between a red wolf and a coyote, especially now that they've interbred. And so if someone kills a coyote on the property and they are charged with $100,000 fine, they feel under siege, and you can see how there's a conversation to be had there that's not being had. And so I find that a really interesting territory.
Yeah, that was something I loved about this book. I guess, and again, thinking about what goes unsaid and people talking past each other, I feel like you actually got to that space in a really interesting way. And I don't know, maybe this is a bit of too abstract of a question, so feel free to say pass. But again, one thing I loved about this book was that you talk about these really timely issues, but they never feel like, capital I issues. It feels like things that matter to people, and they're sometimes talking past each other, but they are in the room together, right? Like they're in the book together. And I felt like seeing that on the page was really, really cool and powerful. Even what you just said about the names, before you started reading this, sorry, Garrett, I keep referencing you. My partner from North Carolina actually looked through and said, oh, I know this name, I know this name, I know this name. And that was a really interesting moment to just see names that he knew about this place kind of represented on the page in a way that he hadn't seen. So I'm curious how you kind of got all that in without the novel feeling polemic. It felt really grounded in this place and true to this place. I don't know, did writing the novel change in the revision process? How did you kind of get that nuance? And again, I feel kind of silly just asking that question because of course it's in the book. To experience the answer in a way, you read the book, right? But I was just wondering a little bit if you can articulate something about that process. You can also say pass.
No, I'll try. I mean, I don't really know the answer to that except drafting and attention and time. I mean, it's hard to write about these issues, and that wasn't what I set out to do. But when you follow an individual story, sometimes these issues arise. And I'm from an area where these issues are very present. So, I don't know how I handled it, except that, it's, 8 years after my first book, and this is my second book. So I just kept drafting it and redrafting it. I knew that this is something that I didn't really want to take on, but it was there, so I found it unavoidable. So I don't know if sometimes I feel that I handled it clumsily, but sometimes you just have to charge ahead and try,
Well, I mean, like I said, there's a lot of the novel about fear, but also about bravery through fear. And I think having those characters and even the sentence that you open with leads you to those issues, it just felt very organic. And I was so glad that you kind of kept moving toward that place, because it would be really easy to be I don't want to go there, right? I'm just going to veer in this other direction. So I thought that was, just really, really wonderfully done in the book. I also was curious, I guess this ties a little bit into what you were saying too about calling your dad and asking these questions. What was it like to write, this is such a place-based book, so grounded, and I know you wrote most of it not in that place. So I was curious what that was like for you. Do you think writing it not in the place allowed you to say things or think about things in a different way?
Yes, I really do. Because I was writing, the final drafts during lockdown, which, I mean, the fear that you felt probably was seeped into the text. It was a pretty dark time. But also, I think I was also thinking a lot about community and what it means. Especially, during the pandemic, some people were doing extraordinary things, and it seemed like, I really wanted to be a communitarian, but, I'm also an extremely introverted writer who, also believes in radical autonomy. So I'm not a great communitarian, but it really did focus my attention on the idea of it and what it might look like. And so I think that's very much in the book, despite the fact that it's a very different community than the one I was living in when I was writing it. But I think sometimes it's better to be closer to the place you're writing in. But the South is different. And also, the place that you grew up is different. Sometimes the distance helps.
Well, one of the things the novel talks about is the South as myth, right? The South as story, and it kind of made a lot of sense to me that writing it away from the place would allow your brain to engage with that dialogue, right? And like to invent and play with those stories more freely.
Exactly.
Yeah. I also, I'm glad you brought up the pandemic, even though that's normally not a sentence I would say. But I was thinking that the story, I believe it's set in 2015, is that right? How did you come to that as the time to set it in?
Well, it makes me sad to say this, but I was more hopeful then, about my home state especially. So I thought, I don't really know where Rachel is now. I don't know if she stayed or not. I think about that sometimes. But I think for her to return after 2015, it probably wouldn't have worked from the beginning.
Maybe I'll ask one more question and we'll open it up. Or maybe my question is there anything that I haven't asked that you want to talk about?
I think you covered everything. There's nothing I can think about, but maybe as questions come, something will come to me that I haven't, that I really wanted to say that I didn't say.
I guess I'll open it up to questions if anybody has any. Yeah.
I have a question. Did your family that still live in North Carolina, have they read the book, and how did they react to how North Carolina was portrayed?
I'll repeat the question for the live stream. So the question is did Amy's family in North Carolina read the book, and if so, how did they react?
I don't think many of them have read it yet, but I did get a really nice text from my nephew this morning. He read it and he was very positive about it, and he's a hunter, so that seemed like a good sign. I'm hopeful that that other family members will be interested in a conversation. We'll see.
I mean, Amy, you touched on this a little. I mean, both of you touched on it about the hunting and the conversation, but can you talk a little more specifically so people understand about the gun piece of your story and the act of gun violence, and sort of why you think people in North Carolina might have an issue with your novel?
So can you speak a little bit to the gun question, and particularly gun violence, and why in, say, North Carolina, people might have an issue with your novel?
Sure. I think, I grew up, I know a lot of people who've been affected by gun violence, and so it did come up in the story. Now, I didn't set out to write a book about gun violence, but writing about the place that I'm from, it became a book that involved gun violence. I do find, just speaking as a citizen now, that when I go home to Eastern North Carolina, people feel, it's so complex. People feel that, I think it's true that rural Americans, it's a different way of life, and there's an idea that the gun conversation is all or nothing, and that if they come for your, I don't know, not AK-40s. If they come for, a certain gun today, they're going to take them all away tomorrow, which is, in fact, of course, not true, but it's also probably a mistake to dismiss the idea that that's how people feel, and so once again, the conversation doesn't happen. But I did think, and I'm hesitant to say this now simply because I feel like I'm talking about my novel, as an issue instead of as a novel. However, I do think kids killing kids is something we all agree that we do not want to happen, and so there ought to be some common ground, somewhere in that issue specifically.
Yeah, actually, one of my questions that I talked about with you is, I have a new baby, and something I found so moving in this novel was just the way that you kind of talk about what should be kind of a basic premise, which is that adults care for kids, right? That there's this really intense guardianship and relationship that goes beyond parent-child, but has to do with adults in the community and their responsibilities to the children in the community. And I thought the way that kind of wove into the novel was really interesting, and I am curious if that was there at the beginning, or how did that sort of thread show up in this book?
I think the question of what we owe future generations is very much on most of our minds, and I think my generation has failed at that question, and so that's something though that I wasn't thinking of consciously. I just think it's there, and I think it's important, of course, for us to think about. And I think in terms of guns, I do think that adults have to be held accountable when children access guns. I mean, I think that's a starting point. I think there could be some agreement on that question or that issue, and I think that I feel like there could be some small glimmer of hope there, because the people I know in Eastern North Carolina, some of them gun owners, also agree that you can lock your gun in a gun safe. There are things that, just practical things that could be done. So I'm sorry, I feel like I'm getting on a soapbox now. But,
No.
I'll take it in a different direction. Is there a character or a creature or someone that was left on the editing floor who we might see again?
I love that. Is there a creature or character left on the editing floor we might see again?
There's a character who wasn't left on the editing floor, but you will definitely see her again.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Is it Vesta?
It's Basta.
Yes.
She's out for vengeance.
I haven't read it yet, so now it's on
Vesta is great.
I love it. It's like
There was gonna be a Vesta spin-off.
it's like a whole Amy cinematic universe, like Marvel, but just really specific.
I could do the creatures, I think. Like a shot at that.
Yeah. So I don't get to ask whether there's going to be a Vesta spin-off, but connected to that, so there's many themes beautifully woven into the novel, and one of them is gender and being a woman and self-ownership, right? And this theme is instantiated through lots of different characters across generations, actually, from little baby, the baby niece, all the way to Vesta and her trio of older women. And I just wanted to ask how you thought about this theme and how you built those different characters that represent different generations and different versions of what it's like to be a woman in that community.
Yeah, that was a beautiful question. So I guess to summarize, how did you build these different generations of women, and there's a great theme throughout your novel of women and autonomy. How did you build those different generations into your novel?
That is one thing that is true to life, I think. I know these generations, and so I did rely on some real life experience for that. And I do think, because I do have a lot of friends now who, of my generation, who believe that, I realize that we think, the way we were brought up, thinking about gender is very different, and though we agree, perhaps that misogyny is the way of the world, the way that some of my friends experienced it is not the way that I experienced it. And they think that the way that I experienced it is something that happened a long, long time ago. But it didn't. And I think also in conservative Christian communities in rural America, which is where I grew up, it's a different, it's a different experience.
So tell us a little bit about how you came to identify as a writer. Is it something like very young, you were like, I'm gonna write something? And tell us about that journey.
How did you come to identify as a writer?
I always wanted to do it, but I didn't know that I would be able to. So as far as identifying as a writer, I mean, that's an interesting question because it seems so obvious, but I'm not sure I can answer it. I just, that's, I don't know, how would you answer that? That's who I am. It's been a pretty long road, but I think that's the one I want to be on. So it might be a dirt road, but
I think even just keeping at this book, you said you've been working on it for a while. Sometimes I think of rather than just identifying a writer, just engaging with the process of writing, and showing up for that process. And it sounds like that's something you really did with this book. You showed up for it in that way.
thank you. That's a better answer.
Sometimes it deflects when I get freaked out. So I'm like, am I a writer? So it's a process.
Yes, you caused a slight existential crisis, but
I was curious, you have one book that's very much set in New York, your first book, and this one's a little bit more South and New York. But in terms of yourself, how do you reconcile being a Southerner but also being a New Yorker in your mind, and how do you think about that tension, or where do you feel your identity currently is, if you do have a set identity regionally, or if you just leave it ambiguous?
Well, so how do you reconcile both your identity as a New Yorker and your identity as a Southerner? How do you sort of deal with that tension, or do you sort of allow it to be ambiguous?
I don't know that I allow it to be ambiguous, but I think it is ambiguous. I feel at this point in my life more at home in New York, but my formative years were spent in the rural South, and so and I do go back and forth between those worlds. So sometimes it feels fracturing, and sometimes it feels enriching, and but it's a good question, and I can't reconcile those two identities, but I also I don't think about it that much in those terms. I'm gonna have to think about that. That's a difficult question. We'll have to continue that, Sujin.
Oh, Samantha. Okay, I had a very similar question to that. So, can you say that you felt like it was very autobiographical for you, or do you like to distance yourself from it? Because I can't say I know you really well, but I've known you for a long time, and I just kept seeing you, especially as the New York Amy and as Rachel, and I didn't know if you felt more strongly about one character, one location than the other.
So can you say if this was sort of autobiographical in some way, and did you feel more strongly about one location than the other?
Yeah.
It's not autobiographical, although, you know, I am familiar with many of the experiences, but I don't know how it is with Yuli, but when you spend years with a character, it's a very strange thing. They're very real to you, but they're not you, and there's no question about that. But they are part of you, so it gets very strange. But I do feel that I do know that I feel a novel is more complete to me when I fully realize that separation between myself and the character. You know, I am like Rachel in some ways and not like her in other ways, but she's also extremely real to me. So I don't know that makes sense.
I think it makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much for taking this time to talk about your novel with us, and thanks everyone for their great questions.
Thank you,
I'm going to echo Lee's sentiments. Thank you all so much for coming out. Thank you to everyone who asked questions. Thank you, of course, to Lee for moderating such a wonderful conversation. And thank you to Amy for celebrating this launch with us. So just a few quick reminders before we wrap up. Amy will be signing and personalizing books at the alcove next to where you checked in. My coworker Jenny is going to point right now to where that is. It's a little bit hidden, but it all makes sense a little bit more in a minute. We just ask that you line up down the center aisle, kind of curve around to the wall. Please make sure that you grab all of your personal belongings with you so that we can start to break down and rearrange the space. We somehow have one copy of Inside the Wolf left, so if you haven't gotten it already, now is your chance. We also have a few copies of Lee's novel, The Party Upstairs, which is a fantastic novel about father and daughter in the Upper West East Side? West Side. So a great novel to read if you're looking to come back up north after your journey south with Inside the Wolf. I think that's all. Let's give these two one last round of applause. Thank you all so much.